pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to the invitation to STU, one of my favorite places, and to Diaz. I well remember when Diaz was in the planning stage. It's wonderful to see it come to fruition. Okay, so here's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the issue of moving towards resilience. These are some things I'll try to do in this talk today. Work in progress, something of a sketch perhaps, but read a lot of stuff, thought about a lot of stuff, and so here's where I am in this thinking. It's kind of embedded in sort of this discipline, this odd semi-discipline of sort of marketing scholarship that Søren and I have some affiliation with. And so the purpose is to sketch a path to a future eco-economy, ecological economy, if you will, and to imagine a future in which the capitalist market economy is dethroned from a dominant position as a tool of resource circulation and value co-creation. So I begin with a critique, because why am I talking about dethroning the capitalist market economy from its current dominant position? So if we think about the crises of the Anthropocene, the crisis of biodiversity, the crisis of global warming, the crisis of the related effects of this on human populations who are being forced to move around the globe, whether they want to or not, resource wars and things like that. Well, at least in the little corner of the world that I live in, the approaches that are taken to this crisis are all market-led approaches. In marketing, we mostly talk about green marketing or green consumption, or a bit about microfinance. We've worked on issues of fair trade regimes and things like that. And of course, some colleagues are interested in the circular economy, et cetera, et cetera. SDU has committed itself to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. But if you read the literature on each of these topics, on each of these areas of work, which have laudable goals, clearly, what one discovers straight away is that there is always a critique of each of these things, and each of these initiatives falls short in some fundamental way. That is, it is confronted with contradictions that are inherent to our market-led economy. I'm going to talk just a little bit about that, but I don't want to dwell too much on that right here. I published on this in a 2021 article in the Journal of Marketing Management that goes through this in some levels. But the conclusion that one has to draw is that our dominant market ontology, our naturalist market ontology, is incompatible with a resilient, I won't use the word sustainable anymore, but a resilient system of resource circulation and value co-creation. These contradictions can't be overcome within the market economy. And it's not just me saying this. Lots of people say this. Everyone from Kate Raworth, coming from a kind of reformist economics perspective, who talks about the donut economy and the mismatch between resource use and resource availability, which is basically a rewriting of the 1970s limits to growth thesis that some of you may be old enough to remember. Or you can move to philosophy. You can read Felice Guattari on the three ecologies. You can move to the Marxist critique from Kohei Sato or John Bellamy Foster, or you can read sort of a more ecological discussion about this, the value of a whale, or one of my favorite authors, Descola, who takes a more ontological approach by comparing the ontological foundations of our economy to other systems of resource circulation and value co-creation in human history. So briefly, why is the dominant market ontology incompatible with a sustainable system of consumption, markets, and so forth? First of all, the resource-intensive profit imperative. Euphemistically, this is called growth. In the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we target 3% annual growth. We're going to grow our way out of the ecological crisis. right? And all of the other examples that I've given, ecosystem services, circular economy, whatever you wish, they all imagine a growth economy, not a resilient economy, not an economy of plenitude, but an economy of growth. Second is the subordination of the commons to primitive accumulation. And you can see this is something that's gone on since the dawn of the capitalist economy. The rape and pillage of the New World in the 16th and 17th centuries, the rape and pillage of the Congo in the 19th century, be examples, and so on we go with the extraction of rare earths today, or to things like the creation of biofuels in the global south, which are supposed to move us away from a carbon-intensive, petroleum-based economy. But lo and behold, when you look and see what goes on in Indonesia or India, production of sugarcane or production of palm oil, what you see, the massive deforestation, expropriation of lands, concentrations of capital, the same old primitive accumulation story. The conversion of nature, which has its own logic, I hope there are some biologists in the audience, into natural resources, which is basically an anthropocentric concept, which means converting nature into something that economists can understand. And reducing nature to something that can be valorized, monetized, traded in a carbon market or something like that, okay? Techno-utopianism. We're going to technologize our way out of the crisis. And so my favorite example here is cryptocurrencies. They're so great because they're immaterial, of course, and then as soon as you look into cryptocurrencies, you discover that the mining of cryptocurrencies consumes more energy in a day than the nation of Denmark. And so you go, and where is that energy coming from? Well, okay, there we go. The sacralization of the neoliberal consumer subject. This notion that this individual is this inviolate unit of society that we inherit from 18th century moral philosophy. What the negative effect of this is, of course, is to responsibilize us. Victoria, it's your fault for not consuming more sustainably. Julie, it's your fault for not consuming more sustainably. Did you recycle this week? Did you recycle your plastic, Elev? Well, and how am I supposed to make sense? This is UTZ certified, this is fair trade certified, this is certified organic. Consumers are put in a position of absolute impossible overload. They would have to be AI creatures in order to process this information, okay? And at the foundation of this is the nature-culture dichotomy, which creates human subjects and everything else is treated as an object. There are no other active agents in the world, just human beings. So this is a very foundational notion. It's deeply embedded in Judeo-Christian thought and so on and so forth. But these are all reasons why our dominant market ontology doesn't serve purpose. And as I say, you can go through all of these things and find the critiques that are quite compelling. Good example is Hickel's discussion of SDP, the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the UN SDGs, which is no matter how many simulations you run, you cannot square the circle. You can't have economic growth and reaching climate targets. It just doesn't work. So we're all, frogs in the pot of boiling water? We need to pay attention here. Okay, so this is not news. These critiques have been out there around. It's nothing new here, so what? We know all this. Okay, so what's the solution? How are there solutions? Are there concrete ways of approaching, of getting out of this, what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, that there is no alternative? Well, in fact, there is an alternative. There are alternatives. I'm going to embed my alternatives in thinking about animist principles. But there are many foundations for this way of thinking. There's Marcel Mauss's The Gift, which tells us that the social contract can be based on something other than Leviathan, than the state. There's the two Daves, Dave Graeber and Dave Vengro, who show in their book, The Dawn of Everything, that the myth of a kind of a unilinear economic history is completely unsupported by archaeological and historical evidence, that human beings have experimented all kinds of crazy economic systems in the past, many, many, many of them. Kojin Karatani, who has discussed the idea that let's rethink world history from the standpoint not of production, but from exchange. And of course, we can also reach into Kantian ethics. Karatani is a bit of a Kantian himself, but Helmut Rose's book on resonance is a Kantian reflection on how to rethink the sort of I-thou relationship, if you will, to quote Martin Buber. So if we read Descola and all of the huge outpouring of work in comes from the ontological turn in anthropology, that is the attempt to take indigenous philosophies of science seriously, we come up with and also indigenous economic practice, system of resource circulation and value co-creation seriously, we come up with a number of tried and true principles of resilience. First, these neo-animist principles interrupt the fiction that nature can be owned and exploited by people who own the land. Animist peoples don't own land. In fact, they don't recognize land as a category. There are other animate actors in the world, along with human actors in the world. But one of the things that's central to animist economies is always return to the land, return of value to the land. Second, extending the principles of sociality to all living creatures. Third, the point that all living organisms, again, I wish the biologists were here, all living organisms exchange, circulate resources, information, materials, and other things to co-create value within particular ecosystems. Animist peoples recognize this. Third, here's a kind of this is a neo-animist principle, but it's based on animist principle. That is one of the things that you discover if you study people who live in tropical rainforests or deserts or live in the high Arctic, is an acute ability to decipher the indexical and iconic signs that are emitted by non-human creatures. In other words, they're acutely attuned to the communicative infrastructure of the ecosystems in which they are embedded. Biosemiotics these days provides us with incredible tools to do a better job of interpreting what our fellow creatures are doing within ecosystems. Compensation, I've already kind of alluded to this, so that animist peoples always compensate the creatures and the plants and so forth on which they depend. There's always this recognition of mutual dependency. And finally, and this sort of gets to the heart of what I want to get at, these principles foster the extension, the reinforcement of mechanisms of resource circulation and value co-creation that are distinctive to, but not exclusive to animist systems of economic relationships. So now I'll talk a little bit about resource circulation. So the three basic principles of resource circulation that you find in animist economies. The first and sort of foundational one, the fundamental one, is the idea of the gift. The gift is not like giving party favors or it's not exactly like treating people to rounds of beers down at Carlson's, but it's not entirely removed from that idea. Basically, it's a notion of positive asymmetry, that is, givers give. There's this notion of that it comes from giving, not from receiving. But in practice, so the idea of one-way transfers is foundational to the gift economy. But in practice, it means, and those of you who've taken economic anthropology know this, that it has to do with the three obligations: to give, to receive, and to reciprocate. Crucial to these systems are also ideas of obligation, So there's no free gift, as Mary Douglas once wrote. These are systems that are intensely obligating, but also the idea that property is inalienable, just as people are inalienable. In other words, you can't divorce things and people from the relational systems in which they are embedded. They can't be alienated, as we say. They can't be owned. Yeah, and the intense replication of gift in the gift economy, as Marcel Mauss recognized back in 1924, is that it creates social bonds. It creates the foundation for social life, absent the state, for example. The second principle is reciprocal exchange. Here the key idea is complementarity. That is the symmetricality of exchange and the complementarity of exchange. So animist systems of reciprocal exchange are quite capable of generating fictive relations of complementarity among related groups of people. So these are fisher people, those are farming people, those are canoe makers, those are potters. In fact, everybody can do everything, but it's useful fiction that people are specialized within these kind of systems. We have elaborates to these systems. We find elaborate examples of these systems in history when these become systems of tribute for security. Then we have the emergence of ancient empires. These are redistributive economies built on this principle of reciprocal exchange. And then finally, we have one that's a little bit weird for human beings to understand, is the idea of predatory symbiosis. This is based on negative reciprocity, the idea that that a being needs something essential from another to complete their being. A repetitive need for some resource that the other has and the ability to take that resource from the other. But that's embedded in a notion that those rights are equivalently distributed. So I can hunt the jaguar, but the jaguar can hunt me. I can hunt a polar bear, but the polar bear has the right to hunt me. That's the kind of idea that we have there. Okay. So these are sort of the very sketchy presentation of something that takes lots and lots of pages of important books. But the reason I bring this up is that these ideas or these principles of resource circulation or these practices of resource circulation and value co-creation are not just confined to some freezing corner of the Arctic where the Inuits are running around chasing polar bears, or up in Lapland where the Lappish people are herding their reindeer, or in the Amazon rainforest. They're actually all around us. We're actually embedded in these systems, whether we know it or not. So that's what I want to turn my attention to now. So Descola calls the system of gift exchange the compost model based on an Amazonian example. But again, as I say, we find these examples of gift economics or gift circulation and value co-creation all around us. I read an amazing study about lateral service exchanges in the United Kingdom. And the authors asked themselves, how do people co-create value? How do they derive value? How do they get mundane stuff done? And what they discovered was that 70% of the value creating activities in British households were completely outside of the market economy. 70%. And that these exchanges were rarely rationalized in terms of, oh, it's cheaper to get my son to do this. They were usually rationalized in terms of something that we would recognize in the gift-giving literature. This builds community. It's more fun. It's more pleasurable. So it's only so that, in other words, a minority of the value created in households in this British example came from the market economy. We find all kinds of gift systems in on the internet. So Marcus Giesler years ago wrote a very cool paper about Napster. That's pretty dated. I'm sure the youngsters don't even know what that is, but basically file sharing system for music. And the ethos was, let the music flow, right? Of course, this got colonized by the market and undermined and turned into Spotify, but the ethos was there at the foundation. Book crossing, another example. I've been amazed by YouTube self-help videos. Have you ever noticed how you can find out how to do anything from a self-help video on YouTube? Now, there's actually very little research on this. And of course, we know, we know about the research about people becoming influencers and monetizing themselves and all that kind of thing. But the majority of people are not doing that. They are not monetizing themselves. And yet what some research has shown is that people are internalizing this knowledge. And in a sense, this sort of porosity of selves, which is associated with a gift economy, reappears through the exchange of knowledge resources through these self-help videos. I myself learned how to refinish wooden floors through self-help videos on YouTube, which I did recently to the everlasting, well, not everlasting, but to the expense of my poor back. Okay, so the Airbnb, another example of this kind of thing, and where we discover that in Airbnb, that is the intense relations of hosting and so forth enliven, enrich, and fructify this sort of extra market-based economy. Second system is systems of reciprocal exchange. The most elaborate example of this that I know of that's sort of outside of a state context is in Catalonia, the Catalonian cooperative movement, which organizes artisanal production, industrial production, agricultural production through a system of cooperatives that are democratically governed. And what's very interesting about the Catalonian cooperatives is they've developed a complementary currency and use blockchain technology to create a complementary currency that exhibits the quality of positive indebtedness, which means that people do not have to balance their accounts in this system. That is, it's possible to run a deficit because there's no profit taking and there's no interest charged on debts. So it's basically kind of a time banking system that's at the heart of how this works. And again, time banking systems. Julie, the Ozanne sisters have done a very nice study on time banks in New Zealand that elaborate on how time banks work. But anyway, the cooperatives are kind of a time banking system that has been able to create a complementary currency while retaining the democratic principles and participatory principles at the foundation. That's based on a long historical precedent in Catalonia. But another example that we see popping up all over the world, there are hundreds of these, are eco-villages. These are intentional communities in which people are experimenting with reciprocal exchange as well as gift giving. And studies, whether in Portugal or in Ireland, find that these kind of indirect exchange processes are able to be relatively self-sustaining, if not undermined by the challenges of moving from a mindset embedded in a market logic to a different kind of mindset, or from regulatory problems that come from outside of these communities. Okay. The most elaborate example of a redistributive reciprocal exchange system is one that all of you Danes and Swedes and Finns and Icelandic people live in, the Nordic welfare state, which is basically an elaborate redistributive economy. When I first moved to Denmark, I was dumbfounded to discover that people were happy to pay their taxes. Coming from North America, this is like so culturally exotic, it was just like, blew my mind. I'd ask students in my classes, undergraduates, so how do you feel about paying your taxes? Oh, I'm so happy to pay my taxes. I get so much back for it. And I've now lived in Finland for 7 years. I lived in Denmark for 3, and what I discovered is that the stress level is just so low, in spite of everybody going on stress leave and so forth. The stress level is just so low because of this redistribution of healthcare, education, leisure time, transport, defense, communications, and so forth, all subsidized by the citizens through the state. So this is the most elaborate example. And of course, here in Denmark, if you get into the cooperative movement, this is a crucial part of Danish agricultural and industrial and consumer history. Sort of the foundations in the early 19th century cooperative movement associated with Proudhon and Owen have kind of been lost, but because it's been kind of subverted by the market logic, but there you go. Okay, the final type that I want to talk about is the Hivero system, which is the system of predatory symbiosis. Indigenous herding practice is the best example I can think of this. So cattle herders in East Africa, the only thing they care about is cows. Absolutely the only thing they care about. Drink the blood, drink the milk, occasionally eat them, follow these things around, spend their lives looking at cows' rear ends. It makes them happier than you could possibly imagine. But it is a relation of taking and taking. The people are dependent on the cows. The cows are dependent on the people. There's a mutual taking. And it's not, what do I want to say? It's like domestication in general. It's not a choice that the animals make, except cats, I think, have made that choice. But, right. We also find examples of predatory symbiosis in closed-loop permaculture. That's why I put a picture of the ducks up here. The ducks in the rice field, eating the snails, eating the insects, fertilizing the rice fields, not eating the rice plants. So there are many examples of people who have been experimenting with permaculture who have found that the more complementary species they introduce into the system, the less entropy there is and the more productivity there is. The coolest example of predatory symbiosis I've seen lately has to do with the kittiwakes the kittiwakes from the Arctic region of the Norway. Long story. Kittiwakes live on a cliff. People live nearby in a village. People had traditionally had the idea of gathering eggs from the kittiwakes during the season. So that's predation. The kittiwake population was declining because of climate change, and nobody knows exactly why, but the government of Norway decided, we're going to protect these poor kittiwakes. We're going to create a natural reserve. So no more egg gathering. What happened? The kittiwakes moved into the town. They left the cliffs and moved into the town, causing absolute chaos, as you might imagine if you have 10,000 birds nesting on your buildings in a town of 5,000 people. Why did they do that? It's because the human predation, the human predators, scared away the avian and other mammalian predators. So the human predation was less than the total predation. So the kittiwakes saw the human predators as allies. That's the most, I just heard that at the Finnish Anthropology Association meetings. It blew my mind. Okay. And of course, here in the Nordic countries, it's extremely well developed in Finland, allemansrätt, foraging rights on public lands. This is an inviolable principle in Finland. It's extremely important to be able to gather things from the forest. Okay? Okay. So my point is that all of these activities through which resources circulate and values are co-created are all around us. Oh, I forgot. I forgot to talk about markets. Markets are okay, but markets, as Polanyi talked about very persuasively in his 1946 book, need to be re-embedded. Healthy markets are embedded in society. In unhealthy markets, society is embedded in markets. So Polanyi, at great length, discusses the history of the disembedding or the re-embedding of society in markets and the disembedding of markets from society, and talked about how to recalibrate that notion. I spent a lot of my misspent youth in markets around the world, in Africa and other places. And of course, one of the things that I learned studying markets in Africa You could see that in the bazaars of Istanbul or in old Cairo. You can even see it you could certainly see it in the Matsutake auction marketplace in Japan, Matsutake or mushrooms, or in the Tsukiji fish market in Tokyo. That markets are embedded in social relations. People, at least the people I worked with in African markets, always talked about they'd rather earn, fast pennies rather than slow shillings. They'd rather benefit together than benefit alone. Anyway, markets are okay, but we have to disembed markets from the various fictions or the various pathologies that I spoke about at the beginning of the talk. Then markets can play a role, particularly a role in between various kinds of cooperative organizations in making economies work. So the paper sketches, at best, a path to a post-marketing eco-economy based on Neo-Animist principles. I really want to bring into focus the fact that these dynamic animist communities, which still exist, which is kind of amazing considering how much pressure they have been under for the last 400 years from the West or the North, if you will, the pressures of the market economy. They persist. Why do they persist? They persist because they have internal resilience in spite of the pressures of colonialism and post-colonialism and primitive resource accumulation. They are a potent source of force for solidarity. These principles have made me rethink my critical perspective on Danish immigration policy. I've understood that this gesture to protect this economy actually makes sense, because if we look at similar economies, the reciprocal economies in the animist world, they also demonstrate this internal solidarity and external suspicion, is how we say. So it's not surprising that Danish immigration policy looks the way it does. It's very consistent with these kind of principles. Very importantly, animist economies always return value to the biome. The forest is understood, so to speak, to be the source of all value co-creation. So you do not find animist economies destroying their own neighborhoods. They just don't do that. And then as I said, we can find examples of gifting, reciprocal exchange, and predatory symbiosis all around us, in nascent form, in rump form, in partial form, in taken for granted form. And when we look at these various experiments, what we see is a lot of times people don't really know what they're doing, exactly, it seems. They don't fully understand the ontology and epistemology of what they are up to, and they don't understand the roots of these things in our animist heritage. So one of the implications for my colleagues which I am happy to share with my colleagues in marketing, is stop trying to get people to consume green. Stop trying to get companies to produce green. It's a fool's errand. Instead, pay attention to these prefigurative experiments in alternative resource circulation and value co-creation, and figure out how to help these kinds of experiments be outscaled or sustained, if you will, against the kind of difficulties that they face given the predominant regulatory environment, which is not either ignores or doesn't understand or is actively hostile to the growth and expansion of these kinds of systems of resource circulation and value co-creation. So with that, I think I've said more than enough. Thank you very much. Happy to take your questions, criticisms, comments, and so forth.
Several minutes before your lunch.
We have plenty of time. There's a lot of stuff here.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. One of the examples you gave about this gifting principle is Airbnb, if I understood correctly. Can you hear me?
Yes, but I missed what you said, the important thing you said.
One of the examples that you gave in relation to the gifting.
Yeah, gifting.
Principle is Airbnb.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was wondering because, I mean, whether...
I misspoke. I should have said couch surfing.
Okay.
I misspoke.
Okay.
Thank you for correcting me. I misspoke.
No, it's because Airbnb, it's been discussed, the extent to which it's a good idea, all the problems that there can be with it, prices going up in the areas, like I'm from Spain, like in Barcelona, for example, right? I mean, it's really problematic. So I was wondering whether, Airbnb can be thought
I think
as
Airbnb,
being a good thing.
I think many examples I've given, in their inception, I gave the example of Napster, and it's a sort of a similar story. Or you could give the idea of Linux, right? Things that begin with a certain type of logic of value, of resource circulation and value co-creation, within a market economy are inevitably colonized by those things. And those of us who do research in consumer community, consumption communities and so forth, encounter this phenomena all the time. So Airbnb is a good example of something that begun with a certain kind of logic and then was colonized by a different kind of logic. Within that problematic context, however, you can still see that things that enrich it are things like positive evaluations of hosts or positive evaluations of guests, which are not reducible quite to an exchange of money for beds. That is, so there's something that is more than just that. And at its inception, there was clearly something that was more than just a bed, right? So yes, but you're quite right. Thank you for that comment and correction.
Thanks, Eric. Oh, is this working? Yeah. You kind of also, you responded to part of what I had in mind when I heard your question, and thanks for, correcting Airbnb to couch surfing. But even couch surfing, even though it kind of still exists today, and I say this as a former couch surfer, at some point, couch surfing started to become a bit more not about reciprocating hospitality, but there started to emerge and rise a new currency within couch surfing, which was sex, actually, the expectation of sexual advances and the reciprocation of those, which is a different type of exchange, maybe not monetary in the sense of a capitalistic market economy, but still has some of the logics there. And then, was it inevitable that this should happen? I'm asking from a very naive and almost curious perspective. That's something that starts with a very different logic, turns into something else, and then also becomes appropriated by something like Airbnb, and then becomes something wholly else. Where I feel like with Airbnb, since there is money exchanged, at least now there is no expectation of some kind of uncomfortable sexual dilemma taking place.
Sure, and I think an interesting thing, so that's a good question, good correction, good continuation of the discussion. So one of the things there is the role of, well, I don't know the answer to this question. My query would be, how many people are involved in Airbnb to make a fortune, to become capitalist entrepreneurs? I suppose there are some, but to some extent and in some cases, this is the market that's embedded. Because if you get bad recommendations on Airbnb, then your capacity to reap monetary benefits is undercut. I know this from dealing with an Airbnb entrepreneur whose intensely concerned about ratings. You've got to have good ratings. We have to do everything to get good ratings. We have to set the place up. It has to be spotlessly clean. This, that, and the other thing. Let's go to enormous lengths to retain that circulation of non-pecuniary value so that pecuniary value can continue. It's quite clear in that case. So that's I would say the sort of the sanitary role of the marketplace. But as you said, all of these kinds of initiatives within a dominant market economy, within any hegemonic economic system, there will be a tendency for other initiatives to be assimilated to the logic of the dominant system. That's sort of like duh. But so again, sort of the implication is, back to my implications, is how do we find ways to help those people who are experimenting with these prefigured examples to defend against those things? So I give the example of the eco-villages. In Ireland, some of the eco-villages actually get government support. So to what extent do local authorities punish or regulate out of existence, or as an example in the kittiwakes, misunderstand and mishandle the relationship? And to what extent can we help people who are trying to do these things deal with the inevitable challenges that will come? Yeah. Does that answer your question, Alev?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely just worth thinking about and trying to find, as you say, ways to safeguard these initiatives from becoming something else.
Yeah.
So, and I appreciate that there's no, clear answer that this is the way.
Are we supposed to climb under the desks also?
Like the 1950s drills, right?
Oh, that wasn't so bad.
Fairly acceptable.
Okay, thanks so much, Eric. That was a wonderful talk and really kind of manifesto-like, which I think suits the DIAS mission in a good way. That's not a negative thing. I don't know if this is a fair question. Is this one working better? No? This one, okay.
We'll use both.
Because it was kind of a toss-off comment at the end, but you mentioned sort of people not understanding the ontology of things, and it just... In the class that I inherited from you, economic anthropology, that I'm teaching today, I'm talking about commodity fetishism and the idea of the mystical nature of goods. And is there a little bit of sort of sense of that these people who don't see the value of animism or the value of reciprocity and social obligations, that they're mystified in some way? Because then you also say, as I've observed, that Danes, for instance, see the value of taxes, they see the value of reciprocity, and when my students write papers on gifts, they understand very clearly the value of these things. So is there a danger of kind of seeing that people aren't aware of the value when really they are, and maybe they're not exposed to enough of these systems to see it?
Well, your last point, I think that's quite clear. Occasionally in the back pages of The Guardian, you'll see something like this, but if you look in the front pages of the mainstream media, these things are not going to be discussed. But my point was not that people who are within. My point was that an eco-village or a cooperative or a file-sharing system, if it's going to work on the principles of the gift, reciprocal exchange, or in the example of indigenous herding practices on the basis of predatory symbiosis, then it has to be understood as a system. It's, speaking as an anthropologist, right, or as a social scientist, these things are systems. They're not sort of, it's not a Chinese menu where you can just take, oh, I'll take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, or at least not in so simplistic a way. So there are implications for management, so to speak. There are implications for what regulatory environment one is in, taxation, rules of doing this, that, or the other thing, which might seem just not important, or that's not our concern, we're just trying to make crafts here or something, are in fact central to the viability of these kinds of systems. So when I say people don't quite know what they're doing, there also is the problem that Elev alluded to earlier, is that we are imbued with a capitalist market mentality, with an individualist subjectivity. It's very difficult to release oneself from that and adopt a more porous subjectivity or a more embedded kind of subjectivity. So this takes work. It's not, just something we decide to do by fiat. So that's what I mean. There's the role for social scientists or others. Or earlier on, I alluded briefly to the role of biosemioticians. There's an incredibly important role for biosemioticians, to explain what the hell is going on with the natural world, rather than, oh, we just need to protect the fill in the blank with your favorite fuzzy animal. Or maybe it's an insect. Protect the bees. We don't need to protect the bees. We need to enter into a much more self-conscious, communicative relationship with the bees so we understand what the hell they're up to. So that's why I say it's difficult to shift gears like this. We need a lot of tools to do that, and people who are experimenting with these systems. I mean, if you go and talk to the permaculture people, they're like, well, we're trying to figure it out as we go along. They don't exactly know what they're doing. So, blah, blah, blah.
Thank you so much. I suppose I have two questions. So a fascinating account of alternative sort of ways of understanding markets and organizing relationships between goods and nature and human beings. I guess my question was, you kind of alluded to it here at the end of your previous answer. Obviously, the current capitalist economy is not governed by these principles, and that's why there's a need to develop different ways of thinking about it. How do we get from these sort of neo-animistic principles, how do we get the current market economy to buy into, to adopt these types of ways of thinking and organizing work? The markets that you referred to are evidently already in place, but could you say more about how that can become a kind of model? If I understood you correctly, these ideas were supposed to be a model for a kind of post-capitalist way of organizing relationships between humans and nature. How do we get there? Is I think that was my first question. And the other one was, at the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned sustainability, and then briefly, very quickly withdrew and said, oh, you won't talk about sustainability, you will talk about resilience. Can you just explain why do you prefer resilience to sustainability? Thank you.
Right. The answer to your first question is, I think that all of these examples that I've given of these different kinds of initiatives that exist are the key to the answer to your first question. Is not by reform of the market economy that we get to something else. You don't solve the problems of the past with the tools of the past. You need tools of the future, although that seems a little ironic since I've been evoking the past. But that's why I'm calling them neo-animist principles. Actually, it's important that I'm calling them neo-animist principles because animists tend to infuse their ideas with ideas related to souls and spiritual beings. Neo-animist, we don't need spiritual beings and things like that to use the principles. But anyway, so I think that the answer is that we need to build on the existing examples that we see people experimenting. And there again, as I say, when you start to look for them, and you have to read across a lot of literature to find them, human geography, energy policy, forestry, you just have to, you can't, because there's no discipline of this, there's no neo-animist discipline, there's no there's no system in which to inscribe all these ideas. You have to be quite eclectic in your search for materials. But as I say, I think the solution is to build on these materials using in a more systematic way the neo-animist principles that I've tried to adduce, adapted to contemporary circumstances. So for example, one of the important and useful tools at our disposal is digital tools, the internet, which makes it possible to do things at a scale that wasn't possible in our human past. So this is not a Luddite lecture by any stretch of the imagination. It's not a techno-utopist position, but it is a position that recognizes the value of technical tools. So we need to combine principles, like the ones I've adduced, with new tools like biosemiotics, new tools like the affordances provided by the internet to develop, to outscale and render these things more resilient. Why do I talk about resilience? The second question, why do I talk about resilience rather than sustainability? I want to get outside of the growth paradigm. I want to talk about resilience, and I want to talk about plenitude. We don't need growth. What we need is abundance. If we go in 1972, Marshall Sahlins, anthropologist, wrote a wonderful article called "The Original Affluent Society," in which he pointed out that the kind of peoples I've been talking about are not poor. They've got lots of free time. And subsequent scholars have come along and said, well, is it really true that these hunters and gatherers don't work so much? And lo and behold, it turns out to be true. They don't work very much. They work even less than Danes, which is kind of a lot. So they work, 10 hours a week on subsistence, things like that, 10, 15 hours a week. So they are not time poor. Plus, they don't have cell phones. Well, they don't need cell phones. They don't want cell phones. They have a richness. They have, as we know from the literature that's been gathered about, well, if we know, our friends in the humanities know about the literature that we have from our ancient human ancestors, we have plenty of a wealth of intellectual riches that date back. So what we need are economies that produce resilience, that is, they are reinforced against shocks, and we need economies that produce plenitude, that is, economies that produce well-being for all of the stakeholders. That means not just human beings, because human beings are not the only stakeholders. We can't survive without all these other folks doing their thing, and doing their thing from a position of resource abundance. We can't be spending all our time running around trying to save the bees and the wallabies and the whoever it is, and the kiwis and everything else. We need to allow them the space to defend themselves. That's an economy of resilience and plenitude. So that's why I don't talk about sustainability. Sustainability is kind of a defensive term from my perspective. I want a more aggressive approach to this. So that's my idea about that. I mean, it's worth discussing. I'm happy to discuss it further. But yeah.
Two more questions.
There seems to be a certain danger of kind of romanticizing the neo-animist world. And I say this, from as someone who's written about long-run economic history and about pre-industrial societies. As we were new to Denmark, we went to the National Museum this weekend, and one of the things that's on exhibit are the various animals that the early Danes drove to extinction.
I would dispute that.
Right. Okay.
I would dispute the driving to extinction. I think that's a retrospective myth that's told in industrial society.
Okay. But
We can debate that.
right. But there are characteristics of these societies, and the other part you see on exhibit in the National Museum, of course, is all of the looting and destruction that early Danes engaged in all across Europe. And what is characteristic, we know, of these societies is relatively high rates of violence.
We know that.
Yes, we do.
I'm not convinced
We
that that's
have very good statistics from...
more violence than today.
Oh, yes, easily. By a magnitude of about...
Okay,
so
a debatable
Denmark,
point.
By a magnitude of 10 or...
A debatable point.
right? And we also know that these societies had great inequalities within them, between gender, for example.
Sure.
Right? And so, as I say, the thing is, if you want this as an alternative to modern capitalism, don't you need to have some idea about, well, here's typically what this system is likely to produce, as opposed to here in the most idealized of worlds is how this system is likely to function.
Well, that would be the conservative critique of this
It might be
position.
a conservative critique, but it could also be correct as a critique, right?
Well, I think many of the points that you raised are, in fact, we can debate them. I don't think that they're necessarily factual, although perhaps you're right. I certainly don't want to pay, but the first point you made, romanticizing, that's the last thing I want to do. The last thing I want to do. This is not, I'm not trying in any stretch of the imagination to paint a utopic portrait. Not at all. If we study the Hivero model that Descola talks about, the Hivero among the Chingu, the people in the Chingu Valley, the Paracana Valley, the Munduruku, the Piraha, the Vari, the Yanomamo, the Nivakle, and so forth, are all headhunters. Because part of their predatory model was to absorb a necessary essence from enemies. So yeah, there was always, the risk of violence was quite evident in the Hivero context. And be an understatement to say that gender equality was not really on the table amongst the Hivero. So you're quite right about those things. But so I'm not arguing. We need to return to the past. What I'm saying, we need to learn lessons of the past that are often obscured by the notions, by certain received wisdom that we have today. This is why I find, for example, Graeber and Vengrov's book, based on just an incredible wealth of archaeological and historical research, trying to rewrite what we know about human history to point out that forms of economic and social organization were far more diverse in the past than we often recognize. We tend to have this kind of, first people lived in bands, and then they formed villages and had agriculture, and then they learned to invent bronze weapons, and then we had there's this sort of unilinear story about how things worked. And in point of fact, the last 50 years of archaeology, classical archaeology and so forth, throw a lot of this stuff up into the air. So I just think what I'm trying to do is create a space for reflection, not propose a utopia, but also to provide principles that we can experiment with to think about doing things differently. Did they drive this and that creature to extinction? I don't think so. Maybe they did. But is that really a critique of, is it a what do I want to say? Is that a damning critique that means, we throw this system out because it's obviously not functional? So there's a lot to discuss there. I appreciate the comment, and that's why I want to offer these ideas around. So thank you very much.
Very last question. Do we have time? Okay, so first of all, thank you so much. I think it was really interesting, inspiring talk. And just a short comment, I think the amount of violence it took to establish a market economy is like magnitudes larger than we have experienced elsewhere. Because you had to ban a lot of non-market-based economies and ways of living.
Sure.
I think that's well described by Marx too. My short question is, I think you're one of many these days that try to, in my interpretation, I might be wrong here, try to combine a kind of a Marxist perspective and an ecological perspective. And my short question, to make it short, because time's up, my short question is, how is that received in each of these camps? I mean, do you have the same kind of problems of convincing each of these camps that there's actually something to be gained from going into coalition with the other sides?
Sure.
Or am I misreading you here?
No, everybody gets along fine. It's no problem.
Happy end.
Yeah, it's a happy ending. No, of course, you know, it's people are committed. When people become committed to particular points of view, it's very difficult to move people off of those things that are well established. And you know, scientific disciplines are called disciplines for a reason. That is, they have rules, regulations, norms, and so forth that establish canons. So when you say, well, you know, the canon's got a fundamental flaw in it, that's going to provoke a lot of backlash. So whether it's ecologists or Marxists or our colleagues in the marketing world or anthropologists, it doesn't really matter who. There's always somebody who's going to say, oh, and that's not, you're a crazy person and that's not all right and you're wrong, you don't know this or you don't know that. That's normal, that's what we would expect in the arena of the scientific inquiry. But the interesting thing is just once people get over bloviating and being furious is to look at what's the critique, what are they complaining about? What's the critique that's being offered? Why is someone wrong about this? Okay, let's address that issue and see if there is a solution, a reasoned solution to that issue. I guess that's what I say. Can we find a solution that's consistent with sort of the certain foundations of a particular field or not? Because sometimes, and part of the principle, part of the argument here is paradigms need to change. And we know that paradigms do change. So yeah, that would be my answer to that question. You bet. Hey, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you, and thank you for your very useful questions. It was a real pleasure. So I hope you all have a good day.